Hello everyone. To this day, Tobey Maguire is still my favorite live-action Spider-Man, and the reason is not because of nostalgia. I do, of course, have nostalgia for the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films, but that's not the primary reason why I like them. I've watched those movies many times over the years. I make it a point to watch the whole trilogy at least once a year. So rose-tinted glasses are not why I feel the way I do about Tobey's Spider-Man. I just think that of the three actors that have played the part over the past 20 years, Tobey's the one that got the closest to the essence of the character of the comics. So first, I'm going to go over Andrew Garfield and Tom Holland's performances, and why I think that they aren't as close to the character as they should be as Tobey was. So with Andrew Garfield, the first problem is that his Peter Parker was all over the place. They tried to show that he's socially awkward and that he's easily bullied, like in the comics, but that doesn't work when you have him also presented as being confident. Because in the beginning scene, when they're trying to establish him as this socially awkward character, he stands up to Flash Thompson. There's the scene where, Flash is telling him to take the picture, when he's shoving another kid's face into his food. And Peter's like, I'm not taking the picture. He says, put him down, Eugene. So he's already standing up to Flash. He already has a level of confidence in himself. But they still want you to believe that he's the socially awkward, easily bullied character, and that doesn't work. Also, his origin is a pretty big departure from the original origin, which was just about a guy being in the right place at the right time. Andrew's Peter got bit by the spider while investigating the mystery of his parents, and his father created the spider that bit him. So yeah, it makes it a lot more about fate than about him just being some guy who just happened to get bit by a spider one day. And then the biggest problem with his Spider-Man to me was at the end of the movie when he breaks the promise he made to Captain Stacy. He looked the man in his eyes as he was dying and said, I promise to stay away from your daughter. And then a few days later, he went back on that promise because it's what works out best for him. No, that's not Spider-Man. That's not the self-sacrificing Peter Parker who has a sense of, the great responsibility that comes with the great power. That's not the character. So after Andrew Garfield, we have Tom Holland, who I enjoy a lot more, even though I think that he's even further from the comic book accurate Spider-Man than Andrew was. The reason I think Tom is actually the furthest from how Spider-Man should be is because of how he's been set up in the MCU. He is dangerously close to sidekick territory. Iron Man is his mentor. He gives him a bunch of gadgets. He gives him his suit. He gives him his iconic suit. So the classic Spider-Man costume that everyone knows and loves, this version of Peter could not make on his own. Tony Stark had to give it to him. Now, yeah, there was a period of time in the comics where Peter worked for Tony and Tony gave him the Iron Spider suit, but that was really different from how it was set up in the movies. Spider-Man at that point had already long been established as a hero. He was a grown man and he was married. And in this, it's heavily a father-son relationship. Really what it is that the MCU made Spider-Man a lot closer to Deku from My Hero Academia than Spider-Man. It's a kid who grows up in a world filled with superheroes. He idolizes these heroes, mainly the big one. In Deku's case, it's All Might, and in Peter's case, it's Iron Man. Peter said, I wanted to be like you. Just like Midoriya wanted to be like All Might. In both cases, this kid in his teen years ends up meeting this hero he's idolized so much. The hero takes him under his wing. Really, that's the same as with Wally West as the Flash, but I compared this Peter more to Midoriya because I think that this version of Peter lines up personality-wise a lot more with Deku than with Wally. Besides, I'll give MCU Spider-Man a little bit of credit. He's not a sidekick, even though he's way too close to it. Just like Deku is not All Might's sidekick. Wally was Barry Allen's sidekick as Kid Flash. Anyway, this is going on a whole tangent. You get the point. That's why I don't think that the MCU Spider-Man is very accurate to the comics at all, is because they took him in a whole different direction. And yeah, they should not have done the same origin over again. That's not what I'm asking for. They could have just started off with this Spider-Man already like a year into his career. We don't need to see him get bit. We don't need to see Uncle Ben die. Just do a story about this Spider-Man in this world that has nothing to do with Iron Man. That wouldn't have been hard. I mean, look at the PS4 game. That's about a Spider-Man who's already been around for 8 years and already has like a long established history, and they throw you in that late into it, and nobody has any trouble following it. Like, you could just say that this Spider-Man has already been around, and you wouldn't have had to have changed his origin, you just didn't have to show it. Like, that's all they had to do. Anyway, on to Tobey. In the beginning of his first movie, we see that he is a socially awkward pushover. And you buy it because of the way that he acts. He very clearly is someone who does not know how to talk to people. God, you have that scene where he thinks Mary Jane is waving at him, and then he awkwardly waves back until he realizes that she's waving at her friends behind him. He is absolutely not the rebellious, skateboarding cool guy that Andrew Garfield Spider-Man is. He does not stand up to Flash Thompson or the other bullies. He has to have his friend Harry do it for him. So yeah, he's very clearly set up in the beginning of the movie to be like the way that Peter was shown to be before he got his powers. A socially awkward nerd who is easily pushed around and cannot stand up for himself. Then he ends up getting the powers, and it has nothing to do with any kind of fate, nothing to do with his parents. Just a guy who happened to be standing in just the right spot to have that spider land on his hand and bite him, just like in the comics. Then as his powers develop and, he starts getting used to them, we see a change in his personality. He's starting to become more confident, and we can see that in how he actually starts to talk to Mary Jane, and then decides he's going to go wrestling to win money to impress her. So he goes and he wrestles, and he wins the money, but it wasn't as much as he should have been paid. So when the guy who, cheated him out of his money gets robbed, Peter decides to just let the criminal go, saying, I missed the part where that's my problem. Just like in the comics, how, he said, from now on, I look out for number one, that means me. He's very self-concerned at this point, and then he pays a heavy price for that selfishness. Now, in Spider-Man 3, it was retconned that Sandman was involved in Uncle Ben's death. Of all the times I've watched that movie, I can't tell what's happening in the flashback where Uncle Ben dies, when Sandman is apologizing to Peter about what happened. I can't tell if the guy Peter let go actually did shoot him, or if him bumping into Flint Marko caused him to pull the trigger by accident. Either way, Uncle Ben wouldn't have died if Peter had stopped that guy. So it's the same effect. Anyway, yeah, just like in the comics, Peter selfishly lets the criminal go, the criminal kills his uncle, and then Peter learns that important lesson of with great power comes great responsibility, and decides to turn his life around. That is what made Peter Parker a hero. It was not some desire to be like a hero he idolizes, which, again, let me repeat, I'm not saying that the MCU should have shown Uncle Ben die again. I'm just saying that they shouldn't have replaced Uncle Ben with Iron Man. But yeah, Peter's goal is not to, impress any other hero. It's not to be like any other hero. It's because he screwed up. And so he devotes his life to making sure that he never screws up like that again. To the point that he throws away the things that he wants most because his responsibility as Spider-Man is more important. We see at the end of the first movie that Mary Jane tells him that she loves him, and he wants nothing more than to tell her that he loves her too, but he can't because he doesn't want to put her in danger. Unlike Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man, who, promised somebody he would stay away from the girl, this Peter didn't have to promise anyone. He just did it because he felt it was what was the right thing to do. That is the self-sacrificing Spider-Man of the comics. Now, this burden of responsibility, Peter accepts it, but in the comics, it's always been shown that it's something that does beat down on him, and it weighs heavily on him. And it gets to the point where, at times, he does want to quit. And, of course, there was the famous storyline in issue 50 of, Spider-Man No More, where he throws his costume away. And so they adapted that story in Spider-Man 2. And they combined it with a little bit of the first Amazing Spider-Man Annual, where Peter ends up, because he doesn't want to be Spider-Man anymore, he ends up having a mental block that shuts his powers off. And then whenever he realizes that he needs them, and he needs to be Spider-Man, they come back. And so they did that in Spider-Man 2. His powers start disappearing because he just doesn't want it anymore. He just does not want the responsibility anymore. He doesn't want to have to deal with it anymore. It's killing him on the inside. And so his powers go away, and he just throws his costume away. He just quits until he realizes that he can't just quit. This is a responsibility that he can't walk away from. This is something that he has to do for the rest of his life. As he says, I will always be Spider-Man. So he reaccepts that responsibility, the powers come back to him, and he becomes Spider-Man once again. There's another thing about Tobey's Spider-Man that he doesn't get credit for, which is that he actually showed Peter's angry side. What I mean by that is that there are times in his movies where you get to see what happens when Spider-Man gets really angry, and that hasn't been shown in any of the other films, really. You look in the comics, there are a lot of times where a villain will do something that just pushes Spider-Man over the edge. One of the big times would be the death of Gwen Stacy, and how, he just became determined to hunt Norman Osborn down and make him pay, and then beat him almost to within an inch of his life before managing to regain his senses. Another example is earlier in the comics, which would be issues 31, 32, and 33, the whole Master Planner storyline, where Aunt May is dying of radiation poisoning, and Doc Ock has the only antidote. And so Spider-Man, just goes and he starts tearing through all these different gang hideouts, trying to find out where Ock is. He's like flipping cars, he's ripping staircases out of the floor. On the cover of the issue where he's doing this says, man on a rampage. And then when he eventually finds Ock and he's fighting with him, Doc Ock actually comments on how he's never seen Spider-Man fight this ferociously before. There was also the time in the Ultimate Comics where there was an imposter dressed as Spider-Man who was committing all these terrible crimes, and when Peter finally caught him, he almost killed him in a fit of rage, and again, regained his senses. So that's an aspect of Peter's character that Tobey showcased that I haven't seen from the other actors. My big example would be the ending of the first movie where Green Goblin, has the upper hand, and it looks like he's about to kill Spider-Man, until he makes the mistake of saying, Mary Jane is next, and then Peter becomes consumed with rage and then turns the tables on him. The anger he felt there at Green Goblin threatening Mary Jane gave him a new level of strength and determination. And, as I said, this is something we can see time and time again in the comics. So that was another thing that I appreciated about Tobey's performance, was showing that side of the character. Now I want to address some of the criticisms with Tobey's performance. First off, that he didn't joke enough. This one I kind of agree with, although it doesn't bother me that much, because, number one, it's not like he didn't joke at all. He did quite a few times in the movies. It's not as much as I would have preferred, but I think it was acceptable. You look at the times where he did crack jokes, they were pretty funny. When he was in the wrestling match, and the guy was like, "What are you doing up there?" And then Peter's like, "Staying away from you. That's a cute outfit. Did your husband give it to you?" Then later on, whenever the Green Goblin attacks the Daily Bugle, and Jonah Jameson's like, "Spider-Man, I knew you two were in this together," and then Spider-Man webs his mouth and says, "Hey kiddo, let mom and dad talk for a minute, will ya?" So even though he didn't joke a lot in the movies, when he did, they absolutely nailed his sense of humor. Now, the next criticism of Tobey is that he cries too much, and I don't understand this, because I've counted all the times that he cries in the films, and it's actually not that much, for one thing, and for another thing, when he does cry, it's at moments that I think any normal person would. So first off, he cries when his Uncle Ben dies. And he's watching the man who has raised him as though he were his own son, pretty much his whole life. He's watching him die right in front of him. So, it makes sense he would turn into a blubbering mess. And then he hears that they're chasing down the killer, and he goes from crying to being filled with rage. The next time he cries is after his graduation, when he's thinking about Uncle Ben. And it's not like when Ben actually died, when he was a blubbering mess. He's just sitting there, tearing up. Again, I think that that's a natural thing that anybody would do. In Spider-Man 2, he doesn't actually cry. He gets sad at a lot of points, and he does get, kind of teary-eyed, but he never really cries at any point in that movie. And then in Spider-Man 3, he cries when he finds out that Sandman was involved in Uncle Ben's death. And again, it's not really crying, it's just one tear going down the side of his face, and then that emotion is quickly replaced with anger. He cries when Mary Jane breaks up with him, and then he cries when Harry dies. Again, all of these, I think, are natural times for a person to cry. So I don't think that that was a problem with Tobey's performance at all. The reason I think that people think so much of that with Tobey is because of all the memes of him crying. Also, he does look kind of funny sometimes when he cries. He does have kind of weird facial expressions, so that doesn't help. But I didn't think that the crying was a problem with his performance because, again, it wasn't as excessive as people make it out to be, and it was at natural points for a person to cry. The final thing I want to talk about with this version of the character would be the organic webbing, which I prefer the mechanical web shooters, but I can live with the organic webbing. The films were able to showcase Peter being scientific in other ways, so I don't think it was that big of a deal. So, that's everything I have to say here. Pretty much, I do want to add that I don't think Tobey is the be-all, end-all Spider-Man actor. I don't think that no other actor could ever come along and do a better job. I just think that, as of now, he came the closest to capturing what the character is all about. So, there you have it. I'd like to add that I do have a Twitter account. I finally remembered to bring that up in one of these videos. So if you want to follow me, there'll be a link in the description to it. So, thank you for watching. Hope to see you next time, and you have a good day.